went to a lot of SANS events as a student back in the day, and every time I went to one, I was just incredibly excited to be surrounded by not only incredible instructors and taking great classes, but also to be able to be with a peer group that is doing the same job as me and be able to bounce ideas off one another, sit in a room with other people working in a SOC and kind of commiserate about the common problems and solutions, and then walk home and back to the team with a whole bunch of new actionable ideas and inspired to change things and make things move for the better.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown. I am Katie Nichols, and I'm a certified instructor for SANS, as well as Director of Intelligence for Red Canary. I'm so excited this month to be joined by Scott J. Roberts, who is the head of threat research at Interpret Security, also the author of an awesome book, co-author of an awesome book called Intelligence-Driven Incident Response. And he's also a member of the CTI Summit Advisory Board. So welcome, Scott. How's it going?
Doing really well, Katie. How about yourself?
So far, so good. Well, thanks so much for joining, Scott. If folks have joined us in previous months, we often will do a threat reporting summary, rundown, etc., which we'll get to at the end. But as I was thinking about topics we haven't covered on a live stream, I realized we haven't really talked about tooling a whole lot. And when I was thinking about who's a good person to talk about threat intelligence tools, of course, the first person that came to my mind was Scott. So if you haven't read Scott's book, he is co-author of it, along with some other really smart people, Kyle Maxwell, Rebecca Brown. And it's one of the kind of foundational books on threat intelligence, honestly. There aren't too many out there. And Scott, I've heard a rumor you're working on version 2.
I think I can safely say at this point, version 2 has gone to press. It's going to be coming out this year, probably right around Black Hat. So we'll be excited to see if there's some kind of thing we end up doing there. But Rebecca and I put a whole lot of effort into updating a lot of things, bringing in a lot of new models. Talking to you, Katie, I hate to say, attack wasn't in the first version. In our defense, it hadn't been released yet.
Okay, that's fair.
We added a bunch of new models, attacks in there, a lot of new things, and just kind of catching up with this field that's really evolved a lot since the first edition came out in 2018. So it's a pretty exciting thing to see.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to finding you late summer and getting the new version signed. So wanted to highlight that. And there are lots of sections of that book that are awesome, but one of the sections I think that's particularly helpful is talking about threat intelligence team tooling. And so kind of starting high level here, right? We talk every month about all the threat reporting and everything that adversaries are doing. And it's usually helpful to keep track of that somewhere. I don't know about you all, can't remember everything in my brain. I have teammates who can do that. I can't. And so a lot of people immediately jump to talking about threat intelligence platforms, of which there are a lot of them. We're going to talk about one open source option this month. And then in future months, I'm going to bring in some other guests to talk about different open source options. But starting out, Scott, you've done a lot of writing and thinking about this. And I like the barbecue metaphor in your blog on Burt Tips, right? Thinking broadly about threat intelligence platforms and tooling, what do you think are some of the first considerations? Like if a CTI team is starting, or if, hey, you're a CTI person who is actually a SOC analyst, what are some of the first things you recommend people think about when they're like, maybe I need a tip?
Well, the first thing I want to say, I am someone who really likes the tooling and enjoys it and has built a lot of tooling and things like that. It's helpful, it's not necessary. And I have been around plenty of teams that have done absolutely amazing work working off of spreadsheets. I worked on a team that did some really amazing work, and we just used an open source wiki. It can be done. I think where tips really become a helpful thing, and by this we mean threat intel platforms, is when you're trying to scale and you're trying to go from things that are really human processes to moving more into automated processes. So at the point where you want to start having intelligence that's exposed to other tools in your organization, you want your SIM or your log management platform to be able to pull things in. You want to be programmatically generating new detections, things like that. That's where the rigor and effort that a tip starts to bring in is really worth it. Because to be fair, even the simplest threat intel platform is going to be an investment of time and investment of effort, probably some hardware, and definitely training. It's gonna take time to get your team up to speed on it. So it really is something I don't think is the first level thing a team needs. But as you start to hit those problems of we're losing track of indicators, we're losing track of adversaries. I think I remember that thing that we did about 2 years ago. What was that again? Which I think we've all had that moment. Going from the moment where you're having to be the person who has it all in your head, because Katie, I'm with you. I am not that person either. To being able to instantly pull it up and see that history on a screen. Once you start having that problem, that's where I think getting into discussion of bringing in a threat intel platform makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. And I think just to highlight, what you said there, I think that's sort of flipped from where a lot of people think, right? I've talked to so many people, and I'm sure you have as well, of like starting CTI teams, and you're like, cool, we have a bucket of money. Maybe it's less money now, but we have a bucket of money, and like we should go buy a commercial tip, or we should, hire someone to stand up an open source tip. And I think the biggest kind of mistake that I've seen is teams just like being like, cool, let's go buy the tool, and we have no idea what we want it to do. Because, right, we talk about this, we're talking about tips as a category, but, right, and I think one of the things your blog post highlights here, using a beautiful barbecue metaphor, is that they're all kind of a little bit different, right? Like some of them take different approaches. So could you talk a little bit about like the types of things that you've seen tips do?
Well, yeah. And I think this is what I went into with why I actually wrote this blog post, was because a lot of times when we say tip, we really mean two different things, and both are valuable, but it really depends on your team. In some cases, what people want is sort of a threat aggregation source. Let's say you're paying for some commercial feeds, you're bringing in a bunch of data. You need to normalize it. You need to deal with the fact that 4 different people are all giving you the same, Mirai botnet IP addresses. You want to bring it into an aggregate so that you can send out one rather than sending out 4 things. There are tips that do that, and that's a really, really useful thing. By the same token, there are tips that I think of more as analytic workbenches. They're places where, once you do have a couple analysts who are focused on trying to, actually work through the intelligence cycle, collecting information, analyzing it, and then building outcomes or outputs that are going to be useful for the rest of your team, you need a place to programmatically manipulate that data. You need a place where you can run enrichments. You need a place where you can pull from multiple data sources, visualize data in a way to help you understand, okay, which one of these was the important one, which one was the outlier, that kind of thing. And so, that's where I break it down here, as you pulled up on the post. These data libraries versus the analyst workbenches. In my experience, if you talk to most tip vendors, they want to say we do both of these great, and some of them do both of them pretty well. But there are definitely specialist tools or ones that default to one or the other. Maltego is a great example. Maltego is really an analyst workbench. It doesn't persist data for you in a way that lots of different tools can get access to. But it's great for enriching, pulling stuff in, manipulating it. This one's useful, this one's not, and then outputting a graph that you can let somebody see. So it's really about thinking, what are you trying to accomplish and what's the right tool for the job?
Yeah, and I think in my experience, a lot of traditional tips that people think of, I would say, fall more in the threat data libraries. Kind of, I think, as you note here, the most common use case is transporting atomic indicators of compromise. Although I will say that many of the tips are, starting to accommodate MITRE ATT&CK and TTPs, but I still feel like a lot of them really excel. That wasn't a pun, excel, but excel at those atomic indicators, which is a valid use case, but it's not everyone's use case. So I think this breakdown is really, really important.
And again, I think it speaks to, what's your team set up and how are you built? If you're one analyst, or you're a primarily intrusion detection and incident response focused SOC, you probably want a library. If you're a company that is bringing in lots of data, is has a dedicated threat intel team, then you probably want to look more at workbenches, and you might need more than one. One team might benefit from an indicator library, and one might benefit more from a workbench.
Nice. So that's a really good kind of high level, right, breakdown. And I love part of the blog post here. Questions to ask when adding new intelligence tools. Like the first one, I think anyone should ask this about any tool that you want to buy. What problem does this solve? Right? Like, again, I think there's this risk of like, we're starting a threat intel team. We need a tip. You're like, whoa, wait, let's back up. What problem does this actually solve? So I think these are really helpful questions for as you are looking at tips or any tooling, right? Are these questions that you can actually answer in a valid way before spending a lot of money or time?
And I would say, especially in the current environment, as you keyed into, where deciding to bring in a new tool means you're not bringing in another data source, means you're not hiring another analyst.
Yep.
And so, if you don't have that first principles you're building off of what are we really trying to accomplish, it's hard to know if you're investing your money the right way. I mean, the number of teams I've seen whose first thought is, we need to buy a massive expensive data feed, and I'm going, whoa, have you looked at your actual incidents inside your own organization? And they go, no, the incident response team won't let us have access to our tickets yet. Well, that's probably not the best use of money or time to start with that. And the same thing applies to tools.
Yep, absolutely. And you got some love for burnt ends from David online. Now you want some burnt ends. So other barbecue fans. I'm also getting hungry. I haven't had lunch yet.
Don't
Nice.
we all?
So I think these questions are really helpful. If you're thinking of buying a tip or any tool, another resource I wanted to share, Andreas, who I never try to say his last name because I just can't. He is one of my go-to people in CTI. He's done some amazing presentations. And one he did at the SANS CTI Summit a couple years ago that I still really go back on is this presentation about threat intelligence platforms. And one of the things he provides, right, and we'll drop a link to the GitHub repo he helpfully created, links to the slides and a lot of different resources on tips. Like if you want tip resources, there's enough to keep you busy here for probably like 2 months. Lots of really detailed papers. But one of the things that I think is really complementary to Scott's kind of list of questions is this spreadsheet that Andreas shared on requirements. We talk about requirements for threat intelligence teams. What do you want to solve with Intel? But also having these requirements for tooling, I think is awesome, right? And I think this is just a great way to break down a little more specifically some of the higher level questions that Scott had in that blog post. Capability to ingest data from different sources. Like what kind of sources, right? Do you have feeds? Do you have feeds in a certain format, right? Sticks and taxi are popular, but if you don't have data in that format, that's not really something you need to look for. And so I think even if you don't go to this extent, right, there are a lot of requirements in here. I think it's like over 100. I would suggest using this as kind of a starting point, right? People always ask like, what are the preferred tips by organizations? We had a question come in already. People always ask me, Katie, there has to be a best tip for you. Like there has to be a best one that everyone just knows is the best that no one will tell me. I don't think there's one. Scott, have you found that there's one single best tip for every single organization?
No, not even close. I think, and this is what Andreas really got to is, do you know your own organization and to know what your needs are? And I think, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, that what's my best tip is really just code for, we don't really know what our organization needs, so we just want the one everybody else has. And I think taking the time to be self-reflective is really going to be beneficial for any organization approaching this, because the wrong tip is a investment that takes a long, I have a friend whose team is trying to move away from the tip that they had previously. It's a multi-month ordeal to translate data from one to another to move over. And so I think really taking the time to identify what you need is going to be time well spent, because undoing it's going to take longer than doing it on the front end.
Absolutely. So all the requirement suggestions you could possibly ever want in this source from Andreas. Highly recommend that. Even if you don't use this, right, just as a way to get you thinking about what you actually need. I know a lot of people do want a list of like, what are some common threat intelligence platforms? Andreas has some of them on here. This is not all of them. And, one of the things I will caution why I don't have an answer for what is the best tip is that they all have such different functionalities, right? As Scott said, or I think about it as a sort of a threat library. Are there ones that have analyst workbench capabilities? They do different things, and there are different price points, right? Open source, it's free, but of course, I don't know if you've heard the saying, free like puppies, right? If I give you a free puppy, the puppy's free, and that's well and good, but then you have to walk the puppy and feed the puppy and take it to the vet. The puppy isn't really free. So, right, on the open source side, on the commercial side, there are definitely some market leaders, but what I would say is that if you know what you need, there are some, right, smaller tips that maybe don't have the market share that cost a lot less. And so if those ones actually meet your needs, you can probably get a great deal on the commercial side. So if you are interested, I think these are a lot of, leading ones. But one that's actually not listed here, which is why I particularly wanted to bring in Scott, because some of the leading ones on the open source side, which is where we're going to focus over the next couple of months, MISP is a really big one. I found crits is probably declining a little bit. That was one from MITRE. Folks, don't yell at me. OpenCTI and Yeti also pretty popular open source ones. But one in particular that a lot of people haven't heard of is called Synapse. And so Scott's one of the people that I've kind of looked to advise on what Synapse is. So Scott, can you explain a little bit for folks who haven't heard of Synapse, which is probably a lot of them, what exactly is Synapse and why is it something that we should be looking at or talking about when we're talking about open source tips?
Sure. So Synapse is I don't even know if I want to call it a threat intel platform. It's an intel platform. I mean, on one hand, you can use it to track. It's definitely built primarily for a lot of the typical indicators of compromise techniques, the things that we think about really in cyber threat intelligence. By the same token, it can also track things like aircraft movements or phone numbers or people going to meetings or organizational charts. It's really an expansive tool that is kind of bridging that gap between the workbench side and the library side. I mean, it has a persistent set of storage. You can build a lot of automation off of it to pull things in. But by the same token, there are multiple ways, both in the open source version and in the closed source version, to be able to manipulate and analyze intelligence in a way that I think is a little bit more natural than a lot of other intel platforms necessarily give you.
Gotcha. And I like your Ted Lasso reference here. I think the new season just dropped. So if folks are interested, right, hopefully, if you've decided I want to check out threat intelligence platforms, is it accessible? Like, what are high level? How do people get started trying it out?
So there's a couple different ways, and Katie, you're free as in puppies analogy, always carries. I've done a lot of my work on it using the open source version, and so you can see the screenshot there. That's primarily a command line based. It literally can be installed with pip for Python, but there actually is a quick start guide from the Synapse folks that just sets it all up in a Docker container. That's what I'd really recommend for most folks. And it drops you into this kind of command line interface where you're using a tool called Storm. And the scary way, but also I think the most honest and getting over the hump kind of way to think about it is Storm is a programming language for manipulating intelligence. And that's a big thing. When you first look at it, you quickly go, oh, it's a query language. It's a little bit like the Splunk query language or SQL. And you can use it that way, and it'll do some basic things. But where I think Synapse really shines is when you're using Synapse to describe what you're looking for as a more of a expansive programming language. You can do variables, you can do loops, you can create functions. And what it really allows you to do is build an environment where you can collect and query and manipulate intelligence in a way that I think is a lot more true to what we're actually trying to accomplish. Another line I know you like, Katie, and I don't remember, maybe you know who said it originally, all models are wrong, some are useful. And, I really think one of the things that makes Synapse shine is the fact that it has a particularly useful model. And so, you can see in this screenshot, I've got the FQDN for Bellingcat. But one of the things we have towards the bottom with the pound signs or hash marks is these are tags. And so Synapse separates out the idea of, those top pieces are facts. That is a domain name. That node was created at a specific time. But the things towards the bottom where I'm saying, okay, I think it's a B tier trustworthy thing, which in my scale is pretty high. It's from a group of journalists, it's from a group of independent journalists, it's from a group of investigative journalists. Those are assessments. And the thing I appreciate as, someone who same as you, Katie, has really studied both, cyber threat intel, but also classic intelligence, is we sometimes lose track of that. What's a fact and what's an assessment? And the fact that that's baked into Synapse from the start, I think is really, really powerful.
And I think what's so interesting to me, and what the shift I've had to make a little bit in starting to use Synapse that I think is useful for anyone to consider, is what's unstructured analysis versus structured. And I will say one of their founders, Vizzy, kind of challenged me early on, right? Because we were like, as an analyst, I want to take notes on everything, right? So I want to write something that says Bellingcat.com is an independent investigative journalism site. And I just want to have my notes so I have that context. And the challenge that he kind of posed, and that I've challenged myself, that I think this concept can apply outside of Synapse, is can you structure those assessment things, right? Certainty levels, or confidence level, high, moderate, low confidence, or your investigation status, right? Or the strength of your link, right? Are you really certain that this IP is connected to this IP? And so I think that's a really interesting shift in just kind of the investigative mindset.
I couldn't agree more. And, once you have those bits in a structured way, you can start using them the same way that, as you alluded to, that we make decisions based on facts. And so being able to say, I only want to see the domains that I have that have an admiralty score of B or higher. If I have that just as a random set of text, I can't make that determination. And if you do any data science kind of thing, the first thing you realize is the hardest part is usually not manipulating the data. It's getting it into a structured format so that you can use it. And this is one of the places where, one of the reasons I've gravitated towards Synapse is it has an opinionated way of doing that is structured. Getting data in, it can be challenging sometimes, and they've done a lot to try to make that easier. And there's a lot that, even with the open source version, you can do to make that easier. But once data is into Synapse, the ability to work with it and manipulate it, I think goes over and above, because there are ways to capture those things that otherwise would just be a snippet of text, or even worse, something you just wrote in a notebook somewhere. And then not just make it available for you, but make it available for anybody else who's using the platform.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to your point on the role of tips overall as helping teams scale, right? Because again, I could write a note and I could store this in a wiki page somewhere, and I could control F, my favorite investigative technique for independent journalist website, right? And you could find, okay, bellingcat.com. But as I do that over days, weeks, months, and years, and a team doesn't really scale. So I think, this is a great example of the scalability, and as you start adding the tags and structuring your data, really helps scale. One thing that I thought was really interesting is the different types of reasoning. And I'm wondering if you could talk us through, right, at a high level of what inductive versus deductive versus abductive reasoning is, because I think that this is just an interesting concept for doing analysis overall.
Yeah, I really wish I was Chris Sanders right now, both for the barbecue and for, probably the better approach to this. But the idea of reasoning and essentially, how do we know things? And there's a better version of this that I've been meaning to put into a different blog post that basically talks about the idea of a cause, an effect, and a rule. And the idea that in each of these types of reasonings, you have two of the three and you're trying to get the third one. So
cause, effect, and rule.
And a rule that describes those things. So inductive reasoning is you have a cause and you have an effect, and you're trying to invent a rule that makes sense for those things. So, the classic example is kind of this comes out of the medical field of if I have a cold, my temperature is probably going to go up. So if you can tie these two things together, sorry, that's not inductive, that's deductive. I need the grid in front of me to do it. But it's this idea of how do we know the things that we know? And to be honest, I spent more time on this part of the blog post than probably the rest of it because I wanted to get this stuff right. And the philosophy / psychology of it is its own thing. But I really don't think we talk enough in cyber threat intelligence about why we know things. And especially this is problematic when it comes to threat intel platforms. One of the things I've shied away from a lot is using force-directed graphs. They're really nice. They make sense. We think we understand them. But how many times have you built a force-directed graph of some threat data? There's a thing in the middle, and that must be the important one because it's the one everything's connecting to. And then you find out that's like MicrosoftUpdate.com.
So force-directed graph being something like kind of the link charts we're all used to seeing. You could do in like Maltego or a link analysis tool, right?
Yeah.
Like this IP has hosted all these other domains, and that turns out that's an Amazon hosting IP or something.
Sure. I mean, how many people have wanted to ban 1.1.1.1 from everything because
or have done it.
Or have done it.
Yeah.
So I think we need to really think through why we know things and how we're getting to the place we're getting to. And what I appreciate, and the reason I brought this up in this blog post, is Synapse makes you do something a little bit different. Instead of just taking a lot of data and throwing it on a graph and just seeing how it all lays out and going, I'm going to look for the one with the most connections, or I'm going to look with the one that's off on its own. With Synapse using Storm, you describe what you're looking for. So it's deterministic. You're going to build a query that says, I am looking for IP addresses with this tag that connect to DNS with this tag that has a registration with this name. And it's not just throwing it on the graph and seeing what comes back. It's taking the time to describe it. And it leads to, and I'm thinking with Dave Bianco here, more of a hypothesis-driven threat intel approach rather than a throw it against the wall and see what sticks approach.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of a very different approach than a lot of people would think of with tips. Generally when I see tips, it's people bringing in indicators. Cool. Then you pump it into your SEM, which is certainly a use case. But, I personally think the really fun stuff in threat intel is when you start to hypothesize, like, why is this connected to this? Like, is there overlap here? Have we seen this kind of thing over the past few months? Have we seen this malware family like connected to this malware family in the same environment? Like all of those questions that, I don't know about your team, but my team has all the time, right? Like we'll start to look at something or read something in a blog post and be like, I wonder if, and I think one of the challenges of just getting used to Synapse or any kind of similar tool is just being like, wait, I can actually ask these questions of a tool and getting used to kind of the query format.
Yeah. And it's a tough mindset to pick up. And weirdly enough, it's one of those mindsets that coming from outside of security can sometimes be easier than being inside of security. I mean, I can say as someone who came up, working in a security operations center, I was used to having a sim that just laid it all out in front of me, and maybe I had to go pull in some data from another place or whatever. But generally speaking, I was analyzing what was put in front of me rather than taking the time. And I think this is where the shift from that type of work to threat intel can be an interesting challenge. Is you've got to stop thinking about the data that's in front of you and go, what other data could be out there? What part of the story am I not seeing? And Synapse really makes it possible to come up with that, describe it, and then see if something comes back. And if something comes back, then you can analyze that. And if nothing comes back, you had a bad hypothesis and you need to try again.
Yeah. So you have kind of in this blog post, walking through different ways of reasoning, but in terms of the key concepts, right? I think it's important for any tip, you need to kind of know the vocabulary, what everyone's talking about, right? When we say things, right? So some definitions, right? We've mentioned storm, which is actually a full language. And this is, in coming months, we'll kind of talk about different open source tips. I think this is a differentiator that I've seen, and why I think you called Synapse more of a threat intelligence system than a platform, because many people think of databases. I think this is somewhat unique, and I'm sure there are other threat intel platforms that do this as well, but that's the actual language that underlies Synapse, right? Sort of a programming language, a query language, both of those things. I've heard some debate over that it helps you kind of ask the questions, right?
Well, it's a lot like Python. You can when you're using Python, you can just type in Python and it drops you into a read event print loop where you can make a single statement, get a single answer, make a single statement, get a single answer. And Synapse will let you do that. And you do that in Storm. By the same token, and what you're talking about, Katie, that I think is, to your point, what makes this kind of a next level thing is you can also, like Python, go into a text editor and start building Storm as written functions and a series of steps that take place, and then save those for later. And so you can do that as macros or even full-on services that do things like pull data from outside sources and make it available inside the cortex. So it's a bigger thing that way, but it's a powerful thing if you go through the investment.
And you mentioned Cortex, right? That's kind of the core service that stores the stuff. Synapse referring to kind of the overall tool. Other lingo to get used to. Lift. I still am not in the habit of saying lift, but basically like searching things, lifting the data. Which, if you think about it, that verb makes sense. Node. This is a concept you're going to have in basically any threat intel platform or system, right? I think of nodes as kind of nouns, right? IP address, etc. And then tags. And you actually have a separate post on tags. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about kind of what tags are and why they're kind of interesting.
So, this, I kind of touched on this earlier. This to me is one of the most exciting and interesting parts, because it shows that, Synapse came out of a Intel world rather than a database world. Because a node is a fact. A node is a thing. And 7777 is an IP address. Doesn't matter whether you like it or not, it's still an IP address. A tag is a kind of flexible thing that usually is describing a node. So to say that 777 is a benign IP address is an assessment. Benign to who? Benign by whose opinion? Benign based on what facts? So I really appreciate this part about Synapse for separating these two things, because putting a node onto the graph should be a pretty notable thing, because it should be something that is or isn't. Tags, by the same token, can be moved and manipulated and changed and are valid in some circumstances and not valid in other circumstances. One of my favorite things is you can actually put time on a tag. So you can say that this tag was valid, saying something was a C2 node, an IP address was C2. It's probably not been C2 since the beginning of time to the end of time. It was probably a C2 for a limited amount of time. And so by capturing that data, you can look it up, but you can also, as you're writing your Storm queries, say, I only want things that were tagged CNO C2 between X and Y time. And Synapse is smart enough to go, okay, was this one tagged that in this time frame? Great, you want that as a result, or no, you don't. So I use tags for a couple other things as well. I use it to manage workflow, but primarily you use tags as a way to give a structured assessment of this is what we think this is.
Nice. And just scrolling down to kind of that section, right? You talked about, to reiterate, right? Facts usually put as nodes, assessment in tags. Good meme here. I like your meme game. It was Science Dude, Christian, credited for that meme. So let's dive a little bit more into this tag concept, because you have a whole separate blog post on effective tagging. And, again, I think, all the concepts we can talk about can sort of apply to other tools. And I like that you talked about the tagging philosophy here. And anyone who's trying to model data consistently probably can relate to this, right? Very draconian, right? From the start, you define, and only me and one other person can create, Scott and I can only create tags, or let people go, be a little, loosey-goosey, just allow whatever. What would you recommend of these philosophies for tagging? If people are getting started with Synapse, I know it depends, but what direction would you send people in? Or why? What does it depend on? What approach you take?
Yeah. So what do I actually recommend? I recommend for most folks, try it with the lenient side, see what happens, and understand you're probably going to have to redo it, because you'll come up with different things. And this can be seen even in the Vertex, the company behind Synapse. They've changed some of their tagging. They've moved from using AKAs to a different thing when they're talking about adversaries. It evolves. It depends. It's going to depend on how many people you have. It's going to depend on what type of intel you're tracking. It's going to depend on maturity. It's going to depend on tools. I'll be honest, I've got some dumb things in my own Synapse instances where I do things like automatically rename stuff, because I have mine set up to be very lenient. So I can do things like misspell the word surveillance in a lot of interesting and creative ways. And so,
what are you using your Synapse for? I'm not going to ask you that. Lots of applications.
Lots of applications. And so, that's the downside of the lenient model. I can literally fat finger, APT 28 to be APT 286. And, that's a problem. But I think ultimately, you want enough flexibility for analysts to be able to capture their assessments, because assessments aren't aren't always an insanely structured thing. I mean, I think I have hundreds of tags in some of my personal instances just by myself. And I imagine that's a thing that gets, exponential the more people you have. But, you've got to kind of play with it and find out what works for you. And I think that the best way to do that is as a hands-on experience.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that, I've experienced as I've started to use Synapse a little bit is the hesitancy, because you don't want to get it wrong. Right. But I don't know. Analysis is messy. Your assessments are going to be wrong sometimes. That's part of intelligence. And so, I think just getting in there and just trying it and realizing, I think, one idea is, okay, just if you're lenient, just maybe audit tags every once in a while, go in and be like, what's everyone tagging? And then that could be one way you could, create some kind of structure. I do like my documentation though. So, one thing as you're using any threatened intel platform, whether it's Synapse tags or, entering data into MISP or anything else, even if you start more lenient, right, over time, you'll realize that if people are entering things differently, you're not going to be able to run the queries and get results consistently. So you're going to have to be a little draconian at some point. No one likes to be that person who's like, Scott, actually, you just made a typo for APT 28 and you need to fix that. But hopefully Scott's okay with me correcting him. So.
I could definitely deal with that. But I think to your point, there are tools that are built in, and this is again where the fact that Synapse or Storm is a programming language as much as anything else can be really useful. So whether it's just using something basic like the move tag function to say, where Katie comes in and goes, you said 286, you meant 28, and I'm just going to move that over. All the way to, we can set up these things called triggers. And triggers are things that automatically happen when something else happens. So I can add a trigger that says, hey, whenever I add a new tag, check if it's tagged APT 286. And if it is, just unapply that tag and reapply APT 28 instead. So, you can, it doesn't have to be draconian. It doesn't have to be just a free for all. You can build in guardrails. And I think the middle ground is ultimately where most teams are going to get to. I think the key is just, you need to figure out what middle ground looks like for your team.
Nice. And kind of scrolling down, I really love that you kind of walk through examples of tags based on the diamond model, which if you're not familiar, right, we talk about the diamond model all the time. It's a really simple way to break down any intrusion event, right? It has 4 key parts, the adversary behind it, the victim of it, and then some kind of infrastructure, like maybe an IP address that deploys some kind of capability, which might be like malware, TTPs, etc. So let's get into some examples here. We've talked in many previous live streams about the challenge of names, right? Group names. And so there's a tag you can use in Synapse for, right, the naming mechanism and which company uses what names. So for example, right here you have the tag, AKA FireEye threat APT1, indicating, right, FireEye /Mandiant /Google identifies this as APT1. So could you talk through kind of some examples here? Like we're just showing different tags, right? What kind of information are we representing here?
Well, so, my tagging, I kind of get into, I break my things down by types and then groups. And then in cases where there's a subcluster, the subgroup. And there are debates between, if you go on to the Synapse Slack, which is an absolutely fantastic resource, you can get into long running conversations about, do you want to go from granular to less granular? Do you want to go from most granular to least granular? How do you want to do it? There's different opinions. It's all about what works for you. Naming is such a challenging thing because is Fancy Bear and APT, 28 the same thing? No, they're 2 assessments. Now, they're 2 assessments that we generally understand are trying to describe the same thing. But what's that thing? And I think in that case, the thing we're talking about is a specific military unit or specific groupings of military unit. It's a messy thing. What I like about Synapse is you can apply those in different ways and have multiple overlapping tags. And so in a lot of cases, I'll do things like pull in indicators from blog posts. And then if 2 different blog posts reference the same IP address and apply the same tag to that IP address, now I can start to understand how is it clustering between these different organizations. But I think it's important and the reason we at least I capture these APT names as assessments, not as nodes, is the understanding that what FireEye or Mandiant views as APT 28 is based on their view into a particular set of victims at a particular set of time with a particular set of telemetry. It's not the same thing as, are you a military unit or aren't you? Are you a member of this military unit or aren't you? So by capturing certain things as nodes and certain things as assessments, Synapse really lets you capture the nuance between the overlaps that exist while acknowledging that there's some fuzziness there. And it's kind of, to me, one of the most unique strengths of the system.
Just a quick example of that. We have some folks chatting in comments, and thanks to the folks from Vertex who are here. This is a demo of the commercial version, but just to kind of show you the concepts here, right, that Scott's talking about. So, we don't like keeping track of names. Maybe we'd like to know what types of indicators does FireEye label as APT1, and what is Symantec called comment crew? This is just an example of a really simple storm query that's just looking for these 2 different tags, right? And what we see is we have a bunch of different indicator types where FireEye Mandiant has called it APT1 and Symantec has called it comment crew, right? And this is just demonstrating, again, this is the commercial version, but you can do these same queries in the open source version just from command line. So this is sort of, one common use case is like, I want to know the indicators or the overlaps between these two group names because I know we all are frustrated with group names. So that's the adversary side. And so, scrolling through, we talked a little bit about clustering, naming. We can talk about that for like 3 hours. Just scrolling through some of the other tags, other parts, right? Infrastructure. What are some of the aspects of infrastructure we might want to capture that you've found are useful in Synapse use cases?
Well, I think we touched on one earlier, which is the idea that most infrastructure is not stood up to be malicious. It's malicious for a period of time, and capturing that difference is really significant. Especially as you look at adversaries that want to use cloud providers. On one hand, you don't want to say that any given cloud provider is completely malicious because you'll break most of the internet. By the same token, you don't want to also come through and whitelist a particular cloud provider and say, no, they've never hosted anything bad. So being able to capture that nuance there is great. The other thing, and you see with the kind of tag hierarchy I put together, is not just is it malicious, but why is it malicious and what was it doing? I'll also add things like, the one you're hovering over right there, hot point likely. Because it's an assessment, assessments are not carved in stone, and they are not yes or no. They are, I'm pretty sure, and we could get into, words of estimative probability and all of that right here. But I'll capture that because I might make a different decision if I think something is likely or, a 96 rather than a 99, than if I just treat it as yes or no, black and white. So having the ability to have tags that can get a little bit more specific gives you the ability to capture information like that. Or even if you go below it, I know this is bad because it was, I trust whoever put it in the threat report, but they didn't say if it was an exploit server or a C2 server or an exfil server but I should keep track of it. So, it lets you capture that kind of stuff as well.
And I think this .likely is a really interesting, this tag is an interesting example of what I was talking about earlier of like making your assessment structured. Because, I don't know, up until I saw this tool, I really would just write a note about like, this is a likely hot point. But that word likely, right? If you have set words of estimated probability that you use, you can, right? You might treat that differently, as you said. And, right, thinking about how you could use this, well, if you're tagging, okay, infrastructure unknown, that might even give your analysts like a new set of requirements. Like if you're consistently tagging this, cool, here's our unknown infrastructure. Someone said it was bad, or maybe we saw it in our environment and we don't know too much about it. Cool. Like maybe someone's task is to go investigate that unknown infrastructure. So
the other thing I would add is you can also make automation work off of that because, you might not want your automation to necessarily flag something that you have tagged as likely the same way you have as something that's, tagged as highly likely. And so, it's hard to get automation to read your personal notes and go, well, Katie said it was likely, so I'm not going to do it in this particular case. But by building that in Synapse, you can have that. So I think that's a powerful thing as well.
Absolutely. So at this point, right, I think there's just a lot of good examples here of like what kinds of tags you can use. And hopefully you can start to imagine, right, if you start to do this consistently, you could also tag with MITRE ATT&CK TTPs, right? Same kind of thing. You can answer questions like, what are the most commonly used techniques? Or what are the most commonly used Mac OS malware families in my data set? And right, I think once you start to tag things consistently, you start to see like there are so many questions you can possibly ask. 0 days, like everyone has all the questions about 0 days, right? What if you could actually like tag how many of them were observed in your data set rather than just everyone panicking about 0 days? So a lot of great examples here. Any in particular you want to call out, Scott?
I mean, I find, I end up using the tags for malware families to specific platforms, particularly important. I mean, I'm lucky. I've mostly been a Mac person for my whole life. So, the ransomware thing, I was just able to kind of, ignore for most of my career because it wasn't as much of a problem in my world.
Macs don't get malware. You heard it here first. I'm just kidding.
Whoa. They have certainly come around, but being able to sit there and say, I'm in an organization that doesn't have a lot of Windows machines. Cool. I'll still capture the threats because, at least in my work, my environment, any threat actor that's only targeting one operating system is just so long for moving to the other ones. It's just going to be a matter of time and a matter of targeting, or even a matter of visibility. Maybe I just haven't seen it yet. But being able to sit there and do things like, okay, what malware hashes should we be feeding into our EDR to look for? Well, if I'm going to be feeding it into, an EDR tool that's only running on a series of Linux and Mac OS devices, running through a bunch of Mac or Windows malware hashes is probably just a waste of compute time. So being able to do that type of filtering can be really, really powerful.
Nice. Well, we are starting to get a little short on time. There's so much to cover. So I wanted to make sure to address some ideas for getting started. So, right, one option in Scott's blog post on getting started, right, installing it yourself. If you're kind of afraid of command line, it's okay. One other option for you is you can actually get a free demo to the commercial instance, right? The commercial instance has the UI that's optic. But what the commercial instance would let you do is kind of get familiar with Storm query language, try out some things. The team at Vertex has put together this really awesome APT1 scavenger hunt that you can request access to. And this is a great way, using that demo instance, just getting used to Storm language, right? Because I found that's a lot of the scary part is I don't know the language, so I can't use it. Well, everything's scary before you learn it. So a great way to kind of get access to those resources, if you just follow the Vertex project, that's a company who makes Synapse, on Twitter. They have a great team. Some of them are lurking in the chat. You can check out, request access that demo instance. That's a great way to get started. If you are I am bold and I'm just going to set up my own and I'm not afraid of command line, which you shouldn't be, it's not scary. Scott has a great walkthrough here, and there are lots of resources. Always good to kind of get in the habit of using documentation, and Synapse has some pretty great documentation. So any parts in particular, Scott, that you'd recommend folks look at in the documentation if they're getting started?
I mean, the getting started guide is really great for understanding not just the how to do it, but also the thought process and the mindset you need going into it. The other thing I would say I end up going to a lot here is the data model documentation. So things like how do I model a particular thing comes down to the forms that are available, and that ends up being the place I end up going to the most. The cool thing, you can actually also get to this data inside Synapse itself. It's actually self-documenting. So once you get good at your Storm, you don't even have to leave the command line or leave optic necessarily. The other thing I would really point you to for getting started with Synapse is, again, the Slack channel. The whole Vertex crew is in there. They're insanely responsive. They're really friendly and happy to help out. And you'll see everything from, hey, I'm just getting started, can you help me get some data in, all the way to folks doing really, really complex and really, really cool things. So it's a great resource both to see how do I do the thing I'm trying to do, but also where could I be going and what could this look like.
And all those resources you can just access from their homepage, which is vertex.link. I think what's cool is we'll see in future months as we talk about other open source tips is that a lot of them have an active community around them, people to help you if you're I have no idea what I'm doing. People like Scott or others who are cool, we got you. If you've encountered a problem, someone's probably had the same problem. So I think that's one of the things that I think is neat about Synapse and a lot of the other open source tips as well. All right. Well, we're almost at the top of the hour. Any last thoughts, Scott, before we hit a few threat reports?
No, let's do some threat reports. Sounds like fun.
Yeah. We got 5 minutes before the top of the hour. So a couple things to highlight. Literally just looking at this one before we got on here. So if everyone says, oh my God, there's a supply chain compromise, this might be what they're talking about today. There is some voice over IP software called 3CX which it looks like that's being used to stage some malicious activity in environments. So, when there's supply chain stuff, everyone are all like, oh, we need the software bill of materials. But before that, knowing if you have 3CX in your environment, if you use it, you probably should look for this. If you don't know if you use it, you should probably look for 3CX. So very timely thing there for you. Next one, actually someone asked about this one. APT 43. So whenever Mandiant comes out with a new APT, highly recommend checking it out. This one's sort of interesting because I think it challenges some of our conventions on like the categories of like cyber espionage. Well, APT 43, North Korean group, they like to mine cryptocurrency to try to fund their operations. And it's like, usually if you see like crypto mining, you're like, oh, they're financially motivated. Well, kind of combining the different motivations of adversaries. So definitely worth checking out APT 43 report. A couple of it's annual report season, y'all. These are great resources for tons of information about what threats are doing. So one I wanted to highlight was the Unit 42 ransomware and extortion report. A lot of great visibility. You can get the highlights here. We know that many types of extortion, double extortion, now maybe triple extortion, where they threaten encryption, exfiltration, and maybe denial of service. Triple extortion, definitely on the rise. So again, these annual reports, a great way to start to look at summaries of what people are seeing across the community. I work for Red Canary. I try not to share our stuff too often, but we also came out with our annual threat detection report. This one covers trends, threats, techniques. If you are looking for, in particular, detection opportunities, how do you detect a lot of these trending threats? We got you covered. Lots of opportunities. And this comes from things that my team uses, for example, to hunt Qbot and detect Qbot day to day. So that's one annual report I hope you'll check out from Red Canary. Lots of others coming out. And then lastly, one thing I wanted to hit, KC7. These folks talked at the CTI Summit. Scott, I know you saw that. So KC7, we had Simeon, Greg, and Emily on in a previous month talking about this really cool free resource to learn about intrusion analysis. And just wanted to highlight a neat blog post from one of their teammates, Justin, on why this is so cool at getting maybe non-traditional backgrounds into cyber, whatever non-traditional means. I just wanted to highlight that they are super active on Twitter, and they're having a really cool free event coming up on, I think it's April 8th. So next week, if you're interested in getting hands-on doing an intrusion analysis, and that's not something you have access day to day, definitely check out KC7. And they were on a previous live stream if you want more on that. Whew. All right, we did it. Really quick hit some of the things to read. And just as we were wrapping up, a couple of reminders. A conference that I'm involved with called SleuthCon is open for proposals. This is from the folks who brought you Cyber WarCon. It's focused on cybercrime, which we talk a lot about on the live streams. So if you're interested in submitting to a conference, if you have an idea to share, go for it. Conference is a great way to get out there, network, share your ideas. So in addition to SleuthCon, also lots of different SANS summits call for proposals are out. So you can check all of those out here. The DFIR Summit is one that's open right now. That's a really big, awesome summit in Texas. Probably lots of great barbecue in Texas, Scott. Am I right? As you find the mute button.
There's a little bit of good barbecue in
a little
Austin.
bit.
A little bit.
Okay. Parts of Texas, maybe. So again, we totally encourage you, if you have something to say, please submit your ideas to all of those open call for proposals. And just a reminder, Scott Roberts, thank you so much for joining us. You can check out Scott's blog, right? scottroberts.io, and keep an eye out for intelligence-driven incident response version 2, maybe later this summer. So Scott, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Katie. Always a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining us today. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you in a future month. Take care.